What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review for Alpha Protocol, the 2010 spy RPG from Obsidian that has since turned into a bit of a cult classic. At this point, I've covered most of the games from Obsidian, but Alpha Protocol is one that I've been wanting to check out for a while, which has been made a little bit more difficult by the fact that just getting your hands on Alpha Protocol these days is a bit trickier than just buying it on sale somewhere. As in 2019, a few years ago, the game was pulled from digital markets due to some licensing issues. So while it's possible for the people who have the game on Steam to continue playing it, it's no longer possible for you to purchase the game. However, you are not without recourse if you really want to play this game, as it did receive a physical release, meaning that there are still copies of the game floating around there for consoles and PC, which is generally speaking your best way to get the game, though failing that, regular old piracy will do the trick as well. Now, Alpha Protocol is an interesting game for a lot of reasons. Generally speaking, when you hear about this one, you will hear that it is a cult classic, it's much loved, it's a spy RPG, of course, but that it's incredibly janky and buggy. And yeah, honestly, most all of that is true. And today we'll be diving into the specifics of that. Though first I wanted to cover a little bit of the history behind this one, because like many early games from Obsidian, this game had a bit of a troubled development history. When Obsidian was wrapping up their work on Neverwinter Nights 2, they were approached by Sega to make an RPG, and while they couldn't commit at the time, the parties involved agreed to concept some ideas and start work on it when it was possible to do so. And the co-founders of Obsidian came up with the idea of a spy RPG, and Sega liked the idea enough to move forward with it. However, due to Obsidian's almost legendary history of troubles, despite them being the originators of the IP, they ultimately gave the rights to it over to Sega as well, which came about as the result of another game they were working on being cancelled suddenly, which kind of backed them into a corner on the matter, provided they didn't want to lay anybody off, which they avoided by signing these rights over to Sega. And while the early parts of development were largely listless, after about 2 years or so roughly 2007-ish, production ramped up, Chris Avellone was brought on, and a more clear picture of exactly what they wanted to do with the game was put in place, a lot of which was inspired by the pop culture around spies, such as James Bond, Jason Bourne, the TV series Burn Notice, as well as a few other notable sources. But even here, there was a lot of rewriting, features that were developed and implemented but then later cut because they didn't feel like it fit. For instance, we can only play as a male character, but at one point there was a female version that was planned. There was a particularly long segment of the game that apparently cost like $500,000 to make, but then was just cut in its entirety. And despite all these troubles and back and forth with Sega about specific parts of it, it ultimately released in May 2010 after missing a release date of October 2009 originally. Now, the initial reception of the game was largely mixed, most people pointing out that it had a lot of problems with combat, bugs, overall it just kind of felt pretty janky. Some of it was incomplete, there were some continuity issues, and even by the standards of the time, it was frankly a bit rough. However, in spite of those things, there were things praised by a variety of people, probably none more so than the emphasis on player choice, which we're going to get into, of course, when we start talking about the story, as there is an insane amount of it. Arguably a little too much given the ideas behind the game. But from there, let's actually talk about the game itself. First, you have to pick a difficulty. This is your regular easy, normal, hard, and it affects more or less what you would expect. But then you have a couple of other options that relate to how you start the game with your character, which is the breakdown of your starting skills. And while these aren't make or break, there's a few important things to note here. There are a couple of presets that will make you good at one thing over another, as this is an RPG and your skills and things like that are important. But the thing I really want to talk about here when it comes to the difficulty section of the game are the recruit and veteran options. Because while the presets give you a starting area, or with the operative option, you can even kind of make your own start, the recruit option starts you out with 0 skills. You have to kind of learn your way around, with your character being quite literally new to Alpha Protocol, which we'll talk a bit more about in just a second. But in addition to this though, the recruit option opens up special dialogues in the beginning of the game that will actually give you a bunch of skill points if you use them, which means it's not that different from the operative start. And then once you've completed the game once on the recruit option, you can then unlock the veteran option, which is kind of like the opposite of recruit. You get a ton of skill skill points to start, and while you won't have maxed out skills at the beginning, you can rearrange them in a way that you will be very, very proficient at the thing you want to do. So essentially, this is an easy mode for the people who have already beaten the game and want to play around with more of the skills, as this game is highly, highly replayable. But from there, let's actually talk about the story itself. Now, the specifics can get a little lost in translation due to the way this game is set up. In broad strokes, we play as Agent Michael Thornton, who is, at the beginning of the game, just joining an organization called Alpha Protocol, which takes on espionage missions for the United States. However, officially, Alpha Protocol does not exist. It's an organization that allows the United States in this world an air of plausible deniability should their operations be discovered. Right before the game begins and we wake up, an airliner is attacked by a missile. A commercial airliner is shot down, more specifically. So when you begin the game and you finish your training, your initial mission is to track down the missiles that were used here and try to put a stop to this happening in the future, as supposedly this was done with stolen missiles. But as you might imagine, it gets infinitely more complicated from there. And this is kind of where we get into full spoiler territory, though given the state of just getting this game, I think that's probably going to be fine for most people, so we're going to talk a little more about the story, in a way that's definitely going to give some spoilers. At the end of the introduction to the game, your character is essentially burned and they attempt to kill you. Obviously, for story reasons, we survive and become a rogue agent. Ironically, the exact purpose of Alpha Protocol. They deny you exist, and other intelligence agencies want you dead. However, with the help of one of the characters, you're able to make your way to various safe houses around the world and continue espionage missions, trying to understand exactly what happened and why they want you killed. And this is where the game gets interesting, because while you can make a few choices at the beginning of the game, the introduction area, once it's wrapped up, sends you into a more free-form hub system which comprises most of the game. At this point, you're free to tackle missions however you please, and this is where the story options get outrageous, because while each location is in a different part of the world, Moscow, Rome, and Taipei, you can do one mission in one of these areas, go to another location, do a mission there, come back, and you can do this in pretty much any order you want. And once you're done with all three areas, the game comes to a close in the end sequence. Now, because of all these options, no one even really agrees on how many endings there actually are, because there are so many variations of things you can do in the middle. That said, though, there are two, I would say, primary endings, which is a sort of bad guy ending and the more traditional good guy ending. However, each of those endings has tons of variations. And I'm not even kidding. You can go look this up. No one seems to agree on how many variations there actually are. I personally ran through about 6 of them, and after reading some old forums, people definitely got endings I did not see either. But overall, a playthrough of the story is going to run you about 10 hours, so it is pretty replayable if you want to see plenty of the endings yourself, or just want to mess around with the recruit veteran options. You have a very replayable short story where it's easy to see a lot of the things you want to see, make different decisions. You can even make a few manual saves here and there to play things out. And the sheer amount of player choice this manages to facilitate is genuinely impressive. However, it is nonetheless a little bit buggy, as you might imagine. You can run into some continuity errors in the dialogue, the speech, especially if you start pushing the boundaries of what the game would expect you to do, which largely seems to be tackle one section of the game at a time. But if you were to say go from Moscow to Taipei in between missions, you might notice some problems in the dialogue where they're referring to things you did recently that you did not recently do, that type of stuff, which I think is probably the first instance that we see in this game, really, where it's obvious the ambition kind of outstriped what they were able to pull off, which I think is the case for a lot of Alpha Protocol. But I just mentioned dialogue, so this game has a relatively unique dialogue system, and I would like to talk about it a little bit. Dialogue is generally timed, and you have several options to choose from that usually range between sort of the suave spy, an angry, straightforward person, or someone who's just cold and professional about everything. You'll also get the occasional responses that allow you to be sarcastic, make jokes, or just get to the point, that kind of thing. And in addition to this, based on information you gather throughout the game on your enemies via intel, you'll occasionally have some extra options as the result of gathering that information or completing objectives in a certain way. For instance, you went and talked to this person first, so now you have an extra option in another mission, that kind of thing. In addition to this, using the various dialogue options a certain number of times can lead you to getting tags and perks. So perks are a system the game uses to kind of identify your past behavior. So eventually your reputation, as you start meeting a lot of people, will start to travel. And if you've been approaching the game in a particular way, the NPCs and people around will start to react to that, acknowledge how your character has been behaving up to that point. And I mention that because that tag system is somewhat similar to what we see in more modern CRPGs to this day. For instance, Divinity Original Sin 2 is very upfront about using a tag system for character identifiers, which is an interesting touch. And while it's hardly new even here, we see that going way back. It's just remarkably well integrated into Alpha Protocol. Now, one downside I do think the dialogue has is the timers. Now, I'm not opposed to the timer being there. My issue is the literal timing of the timer. You see, oftentimes you do not get enough time to actually hear what the NPC is saying. A lot of times the timer will start before the character is even done talking, and in some egregious instances, the timer is literally over before a character has finished talking. Meaning that you're expected to pick a response when you don't even know what the character talking to you is saying. In addition to this, sometimes the options that are shown on screen aren't really indicative of what you're about to say, which is important because, again, this game is big on player choice. Individual NPCs have things they respond well to and things they don't like, and playing up the reputation system with each character has benefits both ways. Some characters you'll get more out of if they don't like you. Other characters, if you're friendly with them, you'll get more out of them. So these are important decisions, and the way the timer is implemented feels kind of clunky. Personally, I would have preferred it if they would at least let the NPC finish talking before the timer starts ticking down. Because while I'm all for adding some weight to the situations via a timer, given the nature of the game, I think it does kind of get in its own way a little bit. Now from here, let's talk about the mission hubs. This is where you're going to be starting your missions from. Every time you go to start a mission, you can potentially buy intel on the black market that will give you modifiers to that mission, depending on the intel that you bought, which can range from things like the tougher enemies being drawn away, giving you just a map of the area, unlocking secret caches, more intel on specific targets you're after, and some of this intel available for purchase can even be influenced by the order in which you do the missions. In some cases, you can pay for the help of someone you've met previously to help you with the mission you're about to go to, as an example. And depending on how you move through the game, you might even see a few unique missions. Now, most of the missions for each area remain kind of static, with the variance being in how you approach them and the dialogue choices that you choose in each of those missions, including some big choices usually at the end of them. However, in a few cases, you can get access to a few missions that you only see if you complete events in a certain sequence, which can oftentimes give you more information about the situation. Now, one thing I do think is worth mentioning right here, though, is that because of all this variation, the middle of the story is almost non-existent. Very little moves here. It's mostly just you making choices with information you have available at the time, talking to and meeting various people, and then the story doesn't really progress properly until the end of the sort of hub system area, when you get to the end sequence, which will then react to all the choices you've made up to that point. And as a result of all this stuff, the breadth of the story can get a little lost in translation, and while it's good overall, it's hard to get really invested in the story because it kind of feels like you're just interacting with a cast of characters sometimes, many of which have their own motivations and stuff, some of which has nothing to do with the main story, which is certainly a little strange. But from here, let's talk progression systems. Now, as I alluded to earlier, a lot of your progression comes from your skills. You get skills as you level up. You get 10 ability points to spend per level up, which you can spend on a variety of skills, mostly weapon skills. Now, this is where the game can be a little broken. There are some very clear winners here if you're looking for just sheer effectiveness, and those are stealth and pistols. And this is largely because the abilities those two give you. Pistols gives you an ability called chain shot, which lets you pause time, mark a bunch of targets, and then take an attack all at once. And this is very, very strong. Late game, you can one-shot some bosses with this. Stealth, on the flip side, will give you an ability to go invisible just completely, and you can just one-shot enemies while you're invisible. So you can go invisible, run around a level, just one-shot a bunch of enemies and move on. You even get a passive ability with stealth that will turn you invisible if an enemy sees you, which is just ridiculous. That said, running and gunning is very much an option if you don't care to go the stealth route. In addition to those, though, there are a few other important skills. All of the weapon skills are viable. Pistols kind of just become the strongest, but my personal favorite was actually martial martial arts. If you don't want to use a gun at all, you can just run around fist fighting everyone, because you get an ability with martial arts called Fury that slows down the world around you in a somewhat similar manner to Pistol's Chain Shot, which will let you just run up and punch people while also giving you increased hand-to-hand damage. Sabotage is also pretty important for handling the game's mini-games. This will make you more effective at lockpicking, hacking computers, and bypassing alarms and stuff, which can be pretty handy. But it is worth mentioning that all of these skills were not created equal. A rank in each one of them costs a different amount of skill points, with stealth costing the most at 6 skill points per rank, and you only get 10 per level. Sabotage, though, only costs 3. Now that said, this is a single player game, so balance isn't wildly important, and if you're playing with like veteran, you can get most of the skills. In a regular playthrough, you're probably only going to want to focus on about 3 of these, because after you finish the introductory area, you get to pick a specialization. These specializations are going to increase the max level for 3 of your skills, effectively making them your tagged skills, and you can increase them farther than all the others. In addition to this, we also have some itemization upgrades as well. So as we progress through the game, we'll get access to various equipment in what is called the clearinghouse, which is effectively the black market, which is where we can purchase upgrades to our guns, our armor, that type of thing. This is also where we go to buy our intel for our missions. And once you've actually got that equipment, it is moddable as well. Weapons can be given various equipment to modify how they function and just make them better overall. Armor is much the same. This can give you all sorts of buffs to various skills, make you invisible to cameras, make lockpicking easier, that kind of thing. But let's talk about those mini games I was mentioning. So the mini games I think are a little clunky overall, but probably none more so than the hacking mini game, because they give you this sort of like Matrix style number waterfall here where you have to find the still numbers in the middle of this waterfall, but you're using the mouse and your keyboard at the same time, which just feels ridiculous. And I mention this because this particular minigame made sabotage almost a requirement, because ranks in sabotage will make the string of numbers you need to match up longer, which makes them easier to see in this sort of waterfall of numbers. And you do get used to it after a while, but I wouldn't ever say this was fun. The lockpicking minigame is very standard, and then occasionally you'll do a bypass number game where you have to click numbers in an order, but you're clicking circuits, so you have to follow them to the numbers. But all of these can be bypassed with an EMP grenade, even the actual physical locks, which does not make any sense at all. But now let's talk about combat a little bit. Combat is easily the jankiest part of this game. Sometimes it's fun, sometimes it barely works. As I mentioned, sometimes it's straight up broken. But an interesting design decision here was the aiming reticle. For any of the actual firearms that you use, you get this sort of giant circle reticle, which is anywhere that you might hit. As this is an RPG, your skill with any various weapon is stat-based, not player-based, meaning that aiming your weapon is based on your version of Michael's skill. Now, if you hold your aim for a little while, that reticle will get smaller, making things easier to hit, and increasing your skill with any given weapon makes you more accurate with it, and waiting until the reticle turns red will make it a critical hit, provided you actually hit something. And overall, it just feels weird. With ranks in each weapon, this will eventually get to a point where it can feel relatively comfortable, but even then, it's still just a very clunky system. And it's one of the reasons I personally enjoyed the martial arts playthrough so much, because you, at that point, don't have to buy weapons, you don't need to care about ammo, you don't have to worry about upgrading your weapons. You can just run around punching everyone in the face, which does not require a reticle. But even that won't save you from the fact that the combat is incredibly floaty. Sometimes you will just randomly face in the wrong direction. Sometimes enemies will randomly teleport to you, which I think is the result of the game trying to spawn more enemies in, but not trying to hide it at all. You can also toss various grenades and things, which is handled by another one of the skills. And despite it being janky and it's sometimes just downright broken, you do have a ton of variety available to you. And if you lean into what your particular version of our character here should be good at, you'll probably be fine. But even this won't save you from the boss fights that are kind of more scripted. Many of the boss fights are done in sort of phases where the character will just spawn out of existence to the next part of the fight, which makes the boss fights feel really out of place compared to the combat in the rest of this game, which is saying something. But even despite all the bugs and the jankiness surrounding the combat, it can still be pretty fun in a sort of fun, cheesy B-movie movie kind of way, where you watch a spy on screen do something that you know just wouldn't be possible. And because of that, it's still kind of fun in its own way, even if the game does very little in the way of explaining itself. And as a random note at the end here, sometimes you'll get access to like a sniper rifle or a turret, but the aiming is so hilariously sensitive that the slightest bit of mouse movement will just send it reeling across the screen to where they're basically useless because you can't aim with them. And while you can certainly get used to a lot of the quirks of combat in this game, it must be said that it is pretty bad as a result, but you can still have some fun with it because it kind of gets amusing after a while. And worst case scenario, just go stealth and pistols and you'll be killing things before they even see you anyway. Now, before we start wrapping this review up, I did want to mention that I really enjoyed a lot of the characters in the game. I think a lot of them were interesting and over the top. Some of them hate each other, and it was kind of cool to play this sort of balancing act between various characters liking or hating you and seeing what you can get out of those relationships regardless. There's romance scenes depending on which of the female characters like you towards the end of the game. And while I think the main story of this one is kind of whatever, the characters that surround the main story are genuinely interesting, and unraveling their connections to the plot can be a fun time. But that brings us to our positives and negatives, and I did want to mention right here that normally I include Steam Deck compatibility with these, but given that you can't buy this game on Steam and just getting it onto a Steam Deck if you actually have to get it from, say, a physical release or a pirated copy, etc., makes the act of getting this onto the Steam Deck very difficult, and as a result, I didn't really have a chance to test it. Though I'm sure if anyone has this on Steam, in the comment section below, they might be nice enough to tell us how it plays on Steam Deck if they happen to own that too. But now on to the positives and negatives. So on the positive side of things, honestly just the player choice and the options. This is a janky bit of a mess of a game, but there are just so many ways to approach it, and the game really does try to let you have a bit of a free-for-all here, even when it probably would have been better to trim down some of these options, as we see with sort of continuity problems throughout the game. But nonetheless, they let you do it. It's fun to mess around with these choices, see what outcomes you can get, and it's a highly replayable game as a result. And another big positive is just a unique approach to an RPG. I can honestly say I've never played a game quite like this, and when you play and review as many games as I do, I think that is a really big highlight of a title, when I can honestly say that this was unique. And it's a big shame that it's probably never going to get a sequel, which is what we'll talk about next. Now, on the negative side of things, unfortunately, there's a lot. Just the jank, the bugs, the continuity errors, the sheer fact that the game is hard to get. Some of the systems are just straight up broken. And because of all these, it's really not hard to see why it was kind of panned by critics upon its initial release. And while there's, again, a sort of cult classic feel to it now where a lot of people can find the enjoyment in it, a decent portion of this game is still a buggy mess, which really brings me to my conclusion. And that is that this game was a really good attempt at doing something new. And while it definitely missed its mark in a few places, it had a ton of poorly executed great ideas. Because there are some ideas in this game that I would love to see elsewhere, or just even a more refined approach to this in a sequel, for instance. But it does so many things in a fun, interesting way, and then just kind of fails to land them. Which is why I think you'll see people clamoring for a sequel on this one that we are unlikely to ever get. Because as I mentioned towards the beginning of the video, the rights to this game are owned by Sega to this day. And if Sega hasn't done anything with it in the past decade, it's unlikely they're going to now. Personally, I'd love to see them sell it to Obsidian and see Obsidian take a second crack at this. Because while there are things about this game that are pretty terrible, there's so much about this game that I loved at the same time. And I would love to see the ideas behind this game given a true chance to shine and kind of get shaped up into a game that actually functions properly most of the time. Because if they did, I think they'd have a hit on their hands. But unless Sega just magically decides to do something with this IP, we're unlikely to see anything like this again in the near future, as the game didn't really meet sales expectations as you might imagine. But that, guys, is going to be my review for the cult classic that is Alpha Protocol, Obsidian's spy RPG. So with all of that said, I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.